Hello, everyone. My name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about what if Shakespeare had had a sister, written by Virginia Woolf. Now, before I go into summary analysis of this work, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and/or comment so that the channel can continue to grow. Now, in this work by Virginia Woolf, we're talking about Shakespeare and pretty much what a woman's life would be like within the 16th century. Shakespeare was born in the 16th century. He had access to education. His parents sent him to school, but the same thing weren't available to women. If Shakespeare had a sister that was as smart as him, and she's a female, she wouldn't be able to write the works of Shakespeare. Now, the thing is, because of the fact that in the 16th century, women weren't sent to school, women didn't have access to education, women didn't have the same rights as men, the things that women could do in terms of work, in terms of development, in terms of being someone, that was very limited. As a woman in the 16th century in England, pretty much all you could do is get married and become a mother and take care of the home. Throughout all of human history, that's what women did. Women were forced to stay at home, do the wash, cook food, take care of the house, take care of the children, bear their husband's children, and that was the work of the woman. Women weren't asked to be creative. Women weren't asked to go to school, and you couldn't, and it pretty much went against the laws. If you went to school, I mean, still to this day in the 21st century, there are countries out there where women, there are certain jobs they can't have. There are certain, places they can't go. Some women are even allowed to drive in certain countries. So women, in terms of human history, still to this day, around the world, there's a lot of things that women don't have access to, and there's a lot of rights that women have. In many parts of the world, women are still fighting to go to school. Some women still don't have access to go to school and learn how to read and learn basic things in terms of literacy. So Virginia Woolf, she's talking in this essay. She's talking about how Shakespeare's life went. He went to school. He learned Latin. He learned the works of Virgil and all the works of the great writers of the past, all the works of the great poets in the past. He studied their work. He learned literature. He was into acting. He did all this and that and the third because he was a man and he had access to it. If you are a man in the 16th century, you're brilliant. You get a chance, you get an opportunity to show how brilliant you are. You get an opportunity to show how great you are. But if you're a woman and you don't want to get married, what's going to happen to you is that you're going to get beaten. Your father was most likely going to beat you into submission. You were going to get married. Most women were married off by the time they were 15, 16 years old. And in most places in the world, that was the norm. I mean, today in the 21st century, women are getting married in their 20s and in their early 30s. But back then, as soon as you're like 13, you're already on the market. As soon as you're like 15 and 16, you're pretty much having your first child and you're already taking care of a home. So the times have changed. People are living longer. The idea of what a woman can be has changed. Today, women have access to jobs and to be who they are and what they are, but it wasn't like that in the 16th century. So Virginia Woolf really, takes us on a journey here. She paints a picture of what Shakespeare's sister would have gone through. Now, Shakespeare did have sisters, but in this scenario, Shakespeare had a sister that was just as smart as him. Her life wouldn't have gone the same way. Her parents would have not sent her to school. She would not have learned Latin. Shakespeare wasn't just a genius. He had to go to school. He had to learn Latin. He had to learn how to write. He had to learn grammar. He didn't just like pop out of the womb and just started to write amazing plays and stories. He had to learn how to do it. And so, his sister would have never had access to education. She would have never developed her skills. And even if she went out looking for a job or looking for an apprentice, no one would have accepted her in because she's a woman. And most likely what would have happened to her, she might have been taken advantage of. or sent back to her father, or outcasted, where she would just pretty much die alone, and people would have mocked her and ridiculed her and called her a witch, or some type of wizard. And so, at that time, women were just, you just couldn't do it. I mean, there are some conspiracy theories in the world today that say that Shakespeare didn't write his works. That's kind of hard to believe. Even if Shakespeare himself didn't write his works, it couldn't be one of his sisters, because they just simply didn't have access to education and the same access to public places as he would with his intelligence. So Virginia Woolf, she really breaks this down. She tells us that in the Queen Elizabeth era, the amount of writings that came out of that era, the amount of masterpieces that came out of that era, because there were a lot of contemporaries in the Queen Elizabeth era, all types of work from Shakespeare and on and on and on. It never stopped. I mean, we're still reading the works of the Elizabethan era still to this day, because it was just a time. It was a time where writers were just coming out left and right. And so, she really goes into this. She said that, women at that time didn't have access. Because, like most men, most great writers that we talk about today, to write, they had special rooms and special studies. They took vacations in different countries and found peaceful places to write, places to inspire them. I mean, there's writers such as John Keats. They didn't just stay still. They went out into nature. They looked at the situations around the countries that they went into. They looked at the situations in their countries and write about that. They were free to go wherever they wanted because they were young men. They could write, and they had all their rights. But for a woman, you couldn't have done that because, first of all, a woman in the 16th century, you don't want to roam the world alone, or roam the countryside alone, because you could have been kidnapped, raped, or anything worse. It just wasn't a good time for women. I mean, you did have Queen Elizabeth. She was educated. She had access to education. But when you're talking about women in general, you're talking about the middle class and the lower classes, it was all about survival. If you were born a woman, you knew that you couldn't get a job like your brother or anybody else. You knew that as soon as you turned 13 to 16, you were pretty much in the market to get married to the boy down the street or some boy in your village and your city. And your parents were going to decide who you got married to. You were going to get married. It didn't matter if you were happy or not. You were going to bear your husband children, and you were probably going to die quite young. I mean, in the 16th century, where there was no modern medicine, I mean, you're not living to 100 years old. If you live to 100 years old, that's extremely rare. So these women didn't live long lives. They didn't have an ability, or they weren't given the chance to be creative with their lives. It was just a backbreaking lifestyle. You were born, you grew up until you were like 13 with your parents, then you were given to your husband, and you live with him. You bear kids, and then you died. It wasn't much of a life. And Virginia Woolf kind of tells us that it doesn't matter if you were happy or not. And the thing is, your husband could beat you, especially in the 16th century where there weren't modern laws. I mean, your husband could beat you, assault you, do anything he wants to you, because as a woman, you had no legal voice. Anything could have happened to you, and nobody would stand up for you because you are literally pretty much your husband's property. And that, honestly, that mindset, that reality didn't change in the world until we reached the 20th century and new laws around the world and human rights, women's rights, child's rights, and all these types of rights started to come out, and people will start to say around the world that, maybe people should have rights, and maybe we should stop abusing and killing and destroying each other's lives. So for much of human history, it's been a bad run. I mean, it's been a horrible, cruel, and depressing run. It's not until the late 20th century that people of all kinds around the world are starting to get rights, starting to get the freedoms that they deserve completely and fully. So throughout this work with Virginia Woolf, she says that women do have the ability to be creative. I mean, it's existed in them forever. I mean, women, even if you don't know how to read, there's certain ways that you can be connected to the world around you and describe things around you, and see things around you that make up great stories. I mean, people, especially in America, in the Native American tradition, the way that you hear about folk tales and Indians and how they used to tell stories, great long stories, just by learning them by heart and by reciting them and by saying them. I mean, the spirit of creativity, the spirit of artistry, it's something that just exists in human beings. And today, maybe in another century, we'll see another a woman pop up like that has the intelligence and the creativity of Shakespeare and do something great with it. Because that's just the human spirit. So in this work, that's pretty much what Woolf does. She breaks it down. She kind of shows us how hard it would be for a woman to have Shakespeare's intelligence to write the works of Shakespeare, because it was almost impossible. You weren't. It was just almost impossible, if not impossible. Honestly, I would lean more towards the side of it being impossible, because it's just. I'm thinking to myself, from reading this piece and from reading what happens in it, I don't see how a woman would be able to do what Shakespeare did, because you didn't have access to education. You couldn't read and write. You didn't know math. Maybe you knew basic math, but there was no schooling. And Shakespeare's works are so complex. Some people give up on Shakespeare's works because they feel like they can't understand it to this day. It's so complex. It's so beautiful. It's so well put together. I mean, Shakespeare even created words. So if you were to do all that without any formal training, it will be very difficult, very hard. So that's pretty much the essay. That's pretty much what happens within it. I mean, in terms of a deeper meaning, in terms of analysis, what I get from here is just the plight of women. I mean, we're in the 21st century now. It's 2020 today, and women around the world are still fighting for their rights. There are women in countries where they can't drive, they can't work in certain places, they have to get married. Arranged marriages are widespread in many countries. I mean, in first world countries, women can choose who they want to marry and stick to who they want to marry. But in many countries around the world, even if it's not in the law books, it's ethnically, societally, it's expected that parents choose the marriage spouse. Women are given to men. Women, their parents choose who they marry. Their parents choose who they're with. And in many places around the world, the men still hold all the power, and the rights of women are often forgotten. And they can't do as much as men can do. And it's something that's very sad, because it kind of limits what we can do as the human race and what we can achieve, because we're always running at like 50-70% of the time, because women are not given their full rights. It's something that's very sad, and it's just the way that Virginia Woolf goes into it and tells us about how just women in the Elizabethan era, just how limited their lives were. You only had one choice. If you didn't get married, it didn't matter if you got married to someone that was insane. He could beat you and rape you and do anything he wants to you, and you can't go back to your parents. You can't go to the law. You can't do anything. You just had to take it. Bear that man kids, and just live. If you were depressed, sad, or angry, you couldn't do anything about it, because you were a woman and your rights weren't protected. And again, it's kind of sad that it's only until the 20th century that women start to get their rights in first world countries. I mean, in America, women had to fight for suffrage and the right to vote. And that was very recent. If we think about human history, that was very recent. So that says a lot about the world we live in. and how far we've come. So that's my perspective. That's my ideas on this essay by Virginia Woolf. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment, and I'll see you guys in my next video.